So it's 2:32. I'll just get us going and introduce Sarah Banker, who is a neuroscience PhD student and a PhD candidate in the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences at the, how do you pronounce the name of your school? Icahn School of Medicine, and this is at Mount Sinai, is that right? In New York. Okay, so why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, does that look correct, everybody? See my slide? Okay, perfect. All right, so thank you for that introduction. I'm excited to be here, and today I'll be presenting some of our recent work showing that individuals with misophonia symptoms show an altered sense of control in social environments. So just to tell you a little bit about myself and our lab, as Mary said, I'm a fourth year neuroscience PhD candidate in Dr. Schiller's lab at Mount Sinai, which is in New York City. So Daniela is my primary mentor for this particular project, but I'm also co-mentored by Drs. Xiaosi Gu and H Foss-Feig. And the Schiller lab is broadly interested in how the brain processes emotions, memories, and social information, and how these systems might be changed in various mental health conditions. And then my dissertation specifically focuses on social behavior in autism and in misophonia. And I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest to report. And I also, before I start, just want to gratefully acknowledge that the work I'll be presenting today was funded through the Misophonia Research Fund. So for our study, we wanted to answer two main questions. The first is how misophonia might relate to other mental health conditions, since we still know very little about misophonia and what psychiatric category it might fall into. And the second question is how misophonia might be related to differences in social perception or control. We were interested in this because we know that in misophonia, most of the triggers are socially generated sounds rather than sounds produced by machines or animals, for example, which suggests that there might be some differences in the way that people with misophonia perceive others. We also see that many people with misophonia are also diagnosed with psychiatric conditions that involve disruptions in control. So things like OCD, where people develop compulsions as a way to control obsessions, or anxiety, in which people are often worried and preoccupied about losing control. And also eating disorders, where people can experience either a loss of control or a hyper-obsession with control over their eating habits. So these are all concepts that we thought were worth exploring in relation to misophonia. To answer that first question of how misophonia relates to other conditions, we had over 1,000 people do an online study where they completed surveys assessing symptoms of various different mental health conditions. Some of you have probably filled out these kinds of surveys before, and you might have noticed that there's a lot of overlap between the surveys. They'll ask questions about your experiences with things like loneliness, attention, mood, sleep, and other symptoms that actually occur in a lot of different conditions. Things like sleep problems and social withdrawal, for example, can occur in depression, but also in autism. So there's a lot of symptom overlap between our diagnoses, which really begs the question of whether our current diagnostic categories are defined in the best way, especially when we're trying to understand the underlying biology. So perhaps these overlapping symptoms can cluster together across different conditions to form new hidden dimensions that represent common threads that tie together certain symptoms in ways that might not be immediately obvious and might not totally align with our current diagnostic system. So to look at this, we used what's called a factor analysis, and we entered the roughly 200 individual questions representing individual symptoms from all our surveys with no information about which survey they came from, to explore which other symptoms cluster together with misophonia symptoms specifically. So with this approach, we're basically letting the data speak for itself and trying to identify which symptoms co-occur the most frequently in the same people. So this approach generated 3 factors, which represent hidden mental health dimensions. And we can look at each factor and see what symptoms across these disorders loaded onto them. So here we can see the list of the surveys that we gave. We've assigned a color to each. And again, here we just wanted to see if individual questions across these surveys cluster together in new ways. And so here is that first cluster or dimension that we found. And to orient you, I know this looks a little overwhelming, but each line here just represents an individual question, and the lines are color-coded by the survey that they came from. So for example, all of these green lines here are questions from the apathy questionnaire. And taller bars represent questions that loaded more highly onto the factor. So here, the highest loading questions were from the apathy, stress, happiness, depression, anxiety, and loneliness questionnaires. So it likely reflects a dimension of mood symptoms. And just a note, the happiness questions loaded negatively because unlike the other questions, they reflect high mood rather than low mood. So just to show you some example questions that loaded onto here, from the depression questionnaire, we have I feel downhearted and blue. And from the anxiety questionnaire, we have I feel inadequate. For the second factor, which we've termed the social factor, the highest loading questions were from the social anxiety, avoidant personality disorder, and autism questionnaires. So again, just reflecting a general theme of social withdrawal. Across different disorders, these symptoms of social disinterest, fear of social situations, and social avoidance tended to co-occur in the same individuals. So for example, some of the questions here from the social anxiety questionnaire were from I never attempt to meet new people, go to parties, or meet with old friends, even if I want to do these things. And from the autism questionnaire, we had, I do not enjoy chatting with people. So for the third and last factor, the highest loading questions were from the misophonia questionnaire in blue, as well as the OCD questionnaire. And then from other disorders that involve compulsions as well, like eating disorders. So this is the factor that we care most about, and we've termed it the misophonia/obsessive-compulsive factor, or the MISO-OC factor for short. Taking a closer look at this factor, we can see that some of the highest loading individual questions were from the misophonia questionnaire, how frequently do the thoughts about the misophonic sounds occur? From the OCD questionnaire, we had, I am upset by unpleasant thoughts that come into my mind against my will. From the eating disorder questionnaire, we had, how often are you preoccupied with the thought of having fat on your body? And lastly, from the alcohol use questionnaire, we have, how often during the last year have you had a feeling of guilt or remorse after drinking? So you can see that these questions are mostly related to intrusive thoughts or preoccupations about some negative thing that you don't have control over, like triggers in the case of misophonia. But importantly, also loaded on here, we see some questions about ways to deal with these preoccupations. So for misophonia, that would be avoiding going to places where you might be triggered. For OCD, arranging items in a really specific manner. Or for eating disorders, compulsively cutting or arranging food. So on a whole, this dimension seems to reflect both that preoccupation with uncontrollable negative things, as well as coping strategies that are an attempt to regain control, but not necessarily in a healthy way.
And we have 5 minutes left.
Okay, great, thank you. So to look more closely into how this factor relates to control-related behaviors in a social settings, we took the people who scored in the lowest quartile on that factor in blue here, representing those with the lowest level of symptoms. and the people who scored in the highest quartile in green, representing those with the highest level of symptoms. And then we directly compared these groups on a task that measures how you exert control in social settings. So the way the task works is that we ask you to interact with people from a town called Aldertown, for example, and these people will offer you a way to split $20. You can choose to accept or reject that offer. If you accept, you both get to keep the proposed amounts. If you reject, neither of you get any money. So the key is that some of these offers are really unfair. Like in this example, Emily is only offering you $3 while she'd get to keep 17. You might choose to reject this offer in the hopes that she'll give you a higher offer next time. And in one of the rounds of the games, that's exactly what happened. So players from one of the towns would increase the next offer if you reject the current one, or decrease the next offer if you accept the current one. But players from the other town just provided totally random offers that didn't depend on your decisions. So we can look to see if people are able to detect whether or not they can exert control over the offers. And when the game is over, we also have people self-report how much control they thought they had over the players from each town. So we can see if they behaved as if they had control and also if they believed that they had control. Comparing the groups on this task, we found that specifically in the round where the offers were random and uncontrollable, people with a high level of misophonia and obsessive-compulsive symptoms in green self-reported a much higher level of control compared to those with low levels of symptoms in blue. So basically, when they played with the group that they had no control over, they still thought that they had control. And we can also look at something called sensitivity to norm violation, or said another way, aversion to unfairness. And this measure is something that we pull out of our decision-making models, and it reflects an unwillingness to accept an offer below the expected value. So if you're expecting $10, you get very offended when you see $8 and you refuse to accept it. And we saw that unlike those with low symptom levels who showed no difference between the two rounds or the two teams, the people with high level of misophonia and obsessive-compulsive symptoms had a much larger aversion or sensitivity to unexpected offers with the uncontrollable team compared to the controllable team. So as a whole, these results suggest that people with more severe misophonia and obsessive-compulsive symptoms have a heightened sense of control over their social environments when none is actually afforded to them, as well as adverse reactions under these uncontrollable circumstances when things happen that don't match their expectations. So we can think about this in another way. Let's say that it's raining outside. Obviously, we don't have any control over the weather, unfortunately, so we usually aren't too upset when we realize that it's raining, because we expect that it's something that's outside of our control. And similarly, we really shouldn't expect that we have control over other people's behaviors. But our results suggest that in misophonia, this expectation might be disrupted. So if you incorrectly believe that you have a high level of influence over the sounds that people make, or maybe a high level of control over your own reactions to the sounds, then the occurrence of an upsetting sound and the associated reaction that you don't have the ability to control would go against this belief and cause a negative reaction that might seem out of proportion with the circumstance. And this control concept also makes sense when you think about the social nature of trigger sounds, because people are really the most unpredictable things in our environment. You know, we usually have some level of, some sense of how a machine or an animal is going to behave in a given situation, which makes them relatively easy to control. But this is not always true for people. As individuals with free will and agency over their actions, people are really the hardest things to predict and control. And this might be why sounds produced by people are the most common triggers that we see in misophonia. So all of these results were published in iScience last year. If you want to read more about them, this is the title and here's the link. And just to summarize, our findings suggest that first, misophonia symptoms load onto the same hidden mental health dimension as obsessive-compulsive symptoms, suggesting that there might be some overlap in the mechanisms underlying these two diagnoses. And second, people with a high level of misophonia and obsessive-compulsive symptoms seem to have more unrealistic expectations about control and seem to become more upset when these unrealistic expectations are not met. So for future work, we need to investigate whether these behavioral differences in social control are related to differences in brain function. And our lab is currently running some studies with EEG and fMRI to try to look at this. And future work should also look at whether treatments that are known to be effective for treating other disorders of control or control-related problems may similarly provide promise in misophonia. So if anyone is interested in learning more or wants to participate in any future studies, you can contact our research coordinator, Alyssa Chen. This is her email, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'm going to start with that overlap in the mechanisms between OCD and misophonia, because we heard earlier that in genetics, perhaps there's no connection. So there's no link between OCD in the very little that we know and misophonia, yet you see some overlaps in mechanisms. Can both of these things be true? How do these two line up together, these two studies?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think both things can be true. And, it's important to note that here we're not really actually looking at direct mechanisms. We're just looking at sort of outcomes. And so the symptoms seem to have some overlap here is what we're seeing in our study. But those genetic results might suggest that it's not a shared underlying biology. I think more research is needed to tease all of that apart. But it's definitely possible that sort of opposite pathways genetically could be producing similar behaviors that we then see in both disorders. Or it could be possible that, two different genetic mutations between the two disorders are leading to the same mechanisms because, there's 3 steps, right? You have genetics, and then you have the biological things that genetics cause, and then you have the behaviors. So there seems to be, at the behavioral level, some convergence, and whether that's true at the genetic or biological level, I think, requires future research. But there's so many ways that those could be, both of those findings could be true, absolutely.
Yeah, and if someone had a related question asking, could we say that people with misophonia may be mentally rigid, which corresponds well with past studies of the high comorbidity between misophonia with ASD and OC-related disorders? So is there a mental rigidity at play? And how would you diagnose that or study that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't really speak to ways to diagnose that because I'm not a clinician, but I do think that the mental rigidity might come into play here. Sorry, excuse me. The autism questions that loaded onto that same factor as misophonia and obsessive-compulsive symptoms were specifically mostly from the sort of rigidity subscale of the autism questionnaire. So it seems like whatever pattern we're picking up here that's related to misophonia symptoms is also related to rigidity.
Interesting, very interesting. And that there are 2 related questions. The first, what are some layperson helpful ways to understand what control is, or what it could be as it relates to a model of misophonia causes, mechanisms, or treatment? How do we understand control?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think about control in relation to expectations. So, everything can kind of be thought of in terms of expectations and outcomes. And so we feel as people that we have control over a given situation when outcomes match our expectations, and we feel a loss of control when those things don't happen. So when things happen that we don't expect. And I would say a way to exert control would be you could do 2 things. You could try to change your own expectations in order to match a likely outcome, or you could try to exert some control over an outcome. And yeah, it's hard to think about exactly what that would mean in terms of a treatment for misophonia, because again, I don't know as much on the clinical side, but I think there's potential ways to integrate things like cognitive behavioral therapy, especially on the side of changing your own expectations, in terms of, if you're changing your expectations in a way that matches with the environment, then you will feel like you have more control over your environment in a way that is productive, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, good. So, related to treatment, someone says that they're not all that familiar with OCD, but they have a little bit of overlap themselves, and they wonder if there's any treatment for misophonia that is already used for OCD. We already did talk a little bit about exposure therapy, which is the classic ERP used for OCD, and then that's not a good fit for misophonia. Are there other lessons that we've learned from OCD that we can bring to misophonia for treatment?
Yeah, I to be completely honest, I'm not 100% sure. Again, I am not a clinician, so I don't know exactly all of the treatments that we have available for OCD. But I would imagine that that is a good place to look, and that people should start exploring, the treatments that we do have for OCD, whether they may or may not be effective for misophonia, both on the behavioral and pharmacological side. I just can't speak to exactly what those would be.
And to the person who asked that, there's, ERP or exposure therapy is a type of CBT, of cognitive behavioral therapy, and that broader branch has definitely proven useful for coping with misophonia. Somebody wanted to circle back to that question about mental rigidity and ask what that means. Is that a clinical term, mental rigidity?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a clinical term, but it's definitely something we think about it in psychology in general. And it's basically kind of the opposite of mental flexibility. So it's things like needing to have a very set routine, or once you have a set opinion on something, being very set in that opinion and not being, super open to changing your mind, things like that. Or even, it can even be like physical things. In autism, for example, we see a lot of rigidity in terms of the specific items that people like to use. People will be very attached to a specific kind of dishware or things like that. And so you can call it kind of almost an obsession with a habit-based, routine-based type of lifestyle, I think, is associated with mental rigidity. Yeah.
And these next questions on control actually relate to mental rigidity, perhaps, or rigidity, the usefulness of it, or practicality. So someone says, in our case, it seems that the misophonic person doesn't think they can control the people around them, but believe that people should or can control things like sneezing, coughing, chewing sounds, etc., and believe the person is doing this on purpose, which adds to their anger. Have you studied this? Thoughts on that generally?
Yeah, so I haven't studied that specifically, but I have heard that quite frequently, anecdotally, and I think it's really interesting. And I still think it plays into that idea of control. And so, yeah, maybe it's not that you believe that you can control someone else's sounds, but you should believe that you still believe that they should be able to understand that you want them to control it. And so it's still, in my mind, sort of a almost disrupted expectations of what people should be able to control in their environments, whether that be yourself or somebody near you. And I also think that it might play into the idea that I know some people have the experience where they're most triggered by people that are closest to them. And I think that you might have a different idea of control with the people that you're closest with as well. Maybe because you think that they know about your misophonia, and they probably do, that they should know what's bothering you and they should be able to stop. And so maybe you think that they should have more control over their actions, or you should have more control over their actions because of your closeness. And that could be why their actions are more triggering.
And couldn't these things also all be almost understood as norm violations? So, right, we expect people aren't purposely trying to hurt us. So perhaps experiencing this as being hurt by someone on purpose feels like a norm violation, which you have studied.
Yes, absolutely. And if a norm violation is sort of back to that idea I was talking about with expectations, because a norm is really just an expectation. And so, yeah, when that expectation is violated, especially when those are people that are very close to you, you have higher expectations of them, that can be even more upsetting. Absolutely, I agree.
Mm-hmm. So again, another related question, if misophonic symptoms are modulated by the level of control over surroundings, can we say that people that have learned to have control over their surroundings may be at higher risk for misophonia?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure about that, because I think if you've learned to have control over your surrounding, but you actually do have control, then that's sort of a different scenario than what we're seeing here. What we're seeing here is having a sense that you have control when you actually do not. So if you've kind of created an environment for yourself where you have a lot of control and you've learned how to do that, then that might actually be a way to cope with it, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I mean, I think that if the same people who've maybe learned to have a lot of control may then be the same people who really feel an extra need to have control, those people might then, yes, be at higher risk for misophonia. That could be true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. We're going back to OCD. So I'll just read this question because it asks for general thoughts. How do you account for this difference between misophonia and OCD? Misophonia is reactivity to an external stimuli, and OCD is internally generated. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that both OCD and misophonia, while I do think they're different disorders, they do have some overlap, and they both do have internal and external components. Because a lot of times in OCD, the thing that is most bothersome is actually kind of intrusive internal thoughts that then people use external things like compulsions to kind of deal with or manage. And in misophonia, it seems to be the opposite, where it starts with an external stimuli, but then turns into an internal reaction. But I think that these things kind of are cyclical and continuously build on each other. And so while in one disorder versus the other, external or internal might come first, they both have both components that feed on each other.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just interject that we have 5 minutes left. So if people want to ask any more questions. Someone else pointed out that OCPTD traits seem to be more highly correlated with the severity of misophonia, not really OCD. Can you talk about the difference between OCPD and misophonia and OCD and misophonia?
I'm actually not very familiar with OCPT, and we didn't include it in this study. We don't have any questions that are specifically from sort of an OCPT questionnaire, so I'm not sure I can speak to that.
Yeah, I feel like one of the fun things that might come from this conference is a list of all the interesting questions that we've all raised that we still have to study for sure.
Yeah,
somebody had a question about meal avoidance and misophonia. So could meal avoidance be due to misophonia instead of an eating disorder, for example?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think, eating disorders or misophonia could both cause meal avoidance, and that might be why we're seeing some overlap there between those disorders on our different psychological dimensions. Yeah, and I think like the food and eating component of both disorders, it makes sense why items would load onto both, because a lot of those questions were things like, avoiding meals, or having some special preoccupations with food-related things, which people with misophonia might have interpreted that question in terms of their misophonia, and people with eating disorders might have interpreted that as it relates to their eating disorder, and come out with the same outcome.
You know, this next question relates to something that has come up throughout the day, and it makes me think, I don't know if we have a centralized place to get this answer, but can you talk a little bit about the overlap between other psychiatric conditions and misophonia?
Yeah, so from what I'm aware of, there's a lot of what we call comorbidity with misophonia. So people that are diagnosed with misophonia tend to be diagnosed with some other conditions as well, which we see really commonly across psychiatry. And I think from my understanding, some of the biggest ones are OCD, autism, anxiety, and eating disorders. And, you know, as I sort of talked about at the beginning of this presentation, it's so hard to know with these comorbidities if people really have two distinct separate disorders, or if they just have these groups of symptoms that really overlap between multiple disorders. And so it's just being categorized as multiple things. Things like, you know, in misophonia, we have some irritability, and we have some rumination over upsetting thoughts, and things like that that we see in a lot of different disorders. But you know, we did this factor approach to try to sort of tease apart what are the biggest symptoms in misophonia that overlap with other disorders. And this is what we saw with the eating disorder and OCD, kind of compulsion type factor. So my sense from this is that those disorders have the most psychological overlap with misophonia.
And Jennifer Brout points out that the factors are correlations. Two things might exist in the same person at the same time, or many people, but we don't know if these are cause and effect, or, you know, like you said, it could just be that certain symptoms look alike, certain behaviors, but the cause is different and the underlying etiology is different.
Exactly. And that, I think, brings back to the first question with the genetic study. It's definitely possible that, you know, these things are arising together in the same people, but not from the same cause. We just don't really know yet.
Yeah. So I'm going to close this out with one very interesting question. And this is from Adil, who is going to be moderating next. Anecdotally, when I talk to folks, there definitely seems to be a feeling of control during a trigger. But most people realize that they don't have control or should expect control after a trigger has dissipated. There are two parts at war with each other internally. Has this timing of where control comes in been considered in research?
That's a really great point. I would say it's not something that we've looked into specifically, although, you know, the perceived control measure that we used here is just kind of an overall, with this team, how much control did you think you had? So it doesn't really look at timing specifically. The aversion to unfairness measure that we looked at is a little bit more timing specific, because it's really looking kind of at the moment of the decision, which would suggest it's sort of after the upsetting thing happens. But I think that is a really important angle and should definitely be studied looking forward, because it seems like maybe it's a flip in control that is causing the upset reactions.
Yes. Yeah. Great question. And thank you. Dr. Rosenthal from the Duke Center answered the question I was hoping someone would answer, to say that the three largest and most rigorously studied studies about mental health in meso found anxiety disorder and mood disorders have the highest overlap, not OCD or autism. So anxiety, and anxiety is anxiety present in OCD too?
There are anxiety-like symptoms, I think, that are present in OCD, and there's a lot of comorbidity there, but they are separate. Yeah.
So thank you for that. So it is 3:05, and I do believe there's a little bit of a break between the next person. So, but it's time to end our session. Thank you so much, Ms. Banker, for that. That was really amazing, really great study.